Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts on the ideas shaping our democracy. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. It's the end of 2025, and this has been, in every respect, an extraordinary year for our democracy, for our Constitution, testing so many of the things we care about in our country. It began, and throughout, we've seen a huge push, especially from President Donald Trump and his administration, to test the boundaries of our Constitution, to break through the rules, the norms, even the laws that constrain power. We've seen a presidential power grab, really unprecedented in a lot of ways. And we've seen efforts to shape and mold American democracy, again, in ways that are, it's easy to say, not normal, but which really would undermine and distort our very constitutional system of government. That's been happening all year, and we are all well aware of that. Something else has been happening, too, something we at the Brennan Center have tried to be part of, which is a response in the courts, a response in the court of public opinion, a response in states all over the country to a lot of these things that raise deep concerns and questions about the direction of our country. We don't know how the story ends, but we know that 2025 is a year where our Constitution is on the line and as our democracy is being tested. We want to discuss that, what's happened, and what we can expect next with some of the leading experts on these issues who I have the privilege of working with here at the Brennan Center. We're going to start with Katherine Ebright. She is an attorney at the Brennan Center and a real expert on presidential power, and Dan Weiner, who is director of our Elections and Government program and an expert on corruption and the role of money in politics. So in a lot of forums, we've said that the great constitutional issue right now is this extraordinary expansion of presidential power, this attempt to extraordinarily expand presidential power. In other areas, it's individual rights or states' rights. But right now, this power grab, in my view certainly, is the big constitutional question about the shape of our government. You, of course, have been working on this, have been warning about this. In Trump's case, President Trump's case, it really started in the first minute of his term with this ceremony with signing executive orders. What should we know about the whole sweep of the year? What's different about this? All presidents want to expand their power. Is this really different?
Yeah, I think the key distinction here, one of the key distinctions, is in the space of war powers, one of the emergency powers that we work on at the Brennan Center, we've seen an unprecedented conflation of crime, which should be dealt with through law enforcement, not the weapons of war.
So police,
yes,
typical way things are done.
Police or Coast Guard interdictions. And what we've seen is an unprecedented effort to use the military to address these law enforcement problems. And we've seen it, of course, in the Caribbean with the ongoing boat strikes policy. We have seen it with the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime law that has only previously been invoked in the War of 1812, World Wars I and II.
So people know about the boats. The Alien Enemies Act, people don't necessarily think of that as being an abuse of war powers. But this was a wartime law. It was used, as you said, to detain people in these earlier declared wars. And it requires you to actually have a declared war with a sovereign government to be used.
Or an invasion or a predatory incursion that is the kind of event that would ultimately lead Congress to declare war. But actually in World War II, FDR invoked the Alien Enemies Act immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Of course, within a day, he got a declaration from Congress of war against Japan, and then within a matter of days, declarations of war against Japan's allies, Germany and Italy.
So this power that had been used to detain Japanese and German and Italian nationals during World War II, this administration, from the very beginning, and he had promised to do this on the campaign trail, they've deployed this to round up Venezuelans and detain them and deport them without due process, or if they've at least tried. And this was this case that was early on and really caught people's attention in a kind of perhaps an unexpected way, of one individual who was wrongly sent to this notorious prison in El Salvador. What happened in that case, and what happened with all these cases? How did the courts step up on this issue of the use of the military domestically, or war powers domestically?
Yeah, so starting with the Alien Enemies Act litigation, the president invoked that law on March 15. The courts immediately blocked him from deporting more people under this law that same day. There was an order that went out at the trial court level in D.C. saying if there are planes in the air bringing these people to another country under the Alien Enemies Act, turn those planes around and do not send any more. And so there's now some contempt proceedings around whether that initial order, turn the planes around, was followed. But the rest of this saying you can't take any more people out of this country under this law until we figure out, are there due process rights being violated? Was this wartime authority inappropriately invoked? Because we're not actually at war with any gang. We're not at war with Venezuela.
Just calling it a war doesn't make it a war. Calling them narco-terrorists doesn't mean anything, really.
Like, you can't say there's an invasion anytime you want there to be these exceptional powers at your fingertips. There actually has to be some sort of military attack, right? And so it's been held up in the courts. It's bounced up and down from the Supreme Court to the lower courts 2 times already. And we think it's going to go back to the Supreme Court, where we hope the justices will say these kinds of exceptional powers, something that was used to intern 31,000 non-citizens without due process, without trials in World War II, can't be unlocked today for whatever reason the president wants.
And there were actual Nazi spies back in World War II, much more genuinely than we have in the current situation. It's an interesting thing because I think from the very beginning, 2 themes that kind of have really come into clearer focus by the end of this year were there from the very beginning. One was that the question about who would stand up to abuses of power, the trial courts, the federal trial courts, people appointed by Democrats and by Republicans really stood up. And often they are not usually eager to get involved in these kinds of things, but they really did. And the other that was interesting is the public, which broadly has supported mass deportation. There's great concern about immigration policy, great sense that the Biden administration messed it up. And people were not averse to having a stronger or different immigration policy. When they started to see the consequences of it, immediately began to turn against it. I was very struck by the fact that polls showed that people really believed due process needed to be followed. And of course, if you asked them what due process was, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you, but they had a broad sense of the basic values behind it. So those are 2 things that started from this first minute.
Well, I think part of the reason you saw that change in how people were engaging with these policies was how radical the policies themselves were. And so it's not just that there's this conflation of crime and war. It's that some of these emergency powers, whether you're talking about a law that's typically used for economic sanctions being used for tariffs, whether you're talking about laws that are for the president federalizing the National Guard or the Alien Enemies Act, these were laws that were being taken completely out of their context and then used to do really shocking things, right? And so Alien Enemies Act, you sent people to a notorious prison in El Salvador where now we have evidence that they were tortured. Right? You just don't do that as normal immigration enforcement.
The president of the country says, I'm the world's coolest dictator.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you see this in the domestic deployments where people can look at that and say, these are some low-level protests. There's not really anything violent happening in Portland. There are some guys wearing frog costumes, right? And then suddenly the military is there, supporting law enforcement or deployed onto the streets. And I think that that's something where normal people look at that and they say, how is this happening? And the courts, to your point, they don't really enjoy stepping into these national security areas. But when they see such shocking things that depart from what the law is for, you have seen this robust response at the trial court level saying these deployments are unlawful. These deployments in one case, violate some of our dearest, most fundamental rules on how the military can be used at home.
And so we're going to put a pin on the trial court because I think in a lot of the stuff we're talking about today, when we get to the Supreme Court, it gets a little scarier. So I want to bring in Dan Weiner. Let's rewind to that opening minute of this administration. In that inaugural scene, which was indoors, what was so striking, what history books will undoubtedly record, was who was sitting in the front row. Who was sitting in the front row? Remind us who was sitting in the front row, if you could, please.
Three of the wealthiest. I mean, Elon Musk, I think, is the wealthiest person in the world. So he was that. He was that. Well, you can never tell. Like, they go up and down. Zuckerberg was one of the wealthiest. Now he's the sixth wealthiest, according to something I saw. So you had a head of the cabinet, a head of world leaders. The poor president of France was way back. You had these three tech titans, sitting there watching the president get sworn in. And it was an extraordinary tableau, right, of this sort of unique confluence of economic and political power that actually had started before the inauguration even happened, right? I mean, Musk was Trump's largest donor. He funded almost $300 million worth of super PAC spending to get Trump elected, and then took a leading role in setting the agenda in the first 6 months. He ran DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. He immediately started, as he put it, putting agencies through a wood chipper. And, this is also someone who has tens of billions of dollars of government contracts, right? So he's not a neutral party here.
So as we talk about corruption, now there's always been corruption.
Right.
Going back, human nature, as that line from, I think, All the King's Men, there was always something,
right.
But this is of a scale that we have not seen in this country, I would say perhaps ever, in the sense that we almost don't have the language to describe this. As you said, the world's wealthiest man paying for the winning presidential campaign, and he literally moving into the White House and being given this kind of prime ministerial authority. John, we talk about the Gilded Age as a time that is akin to this moment. John D. Rockefeller did not move into the White House.
The presidents of the Gilded Age didn't engage in this kind of personal corruption. I mean, one of the things is that Trump, according to one estimate from Forbes, has made $3 billion off businesses that benefit from his role as president right now.
In the past year.
Right. So he has this massive crypto, and we've never had a president who did anything like this, right?
So it's we're used to thinking of modern corruption as being sort of like the campaign finance system,
right.
Systemic corruption. This is a resurgence of almost an earlier form of corruption, Tammany Hall on steroids, where the power of the federal government for really the first time
right.
in a long time, since Teapot Dome maybe, is being leveraged to line the pockets of the people who control
getting into what Katherine was just talking about too. So you also have the presidency that is completely different now, right? You have a presidency that has been unmoored from many of the sort of traditional checks and balances, right? And then a president, right, who sort of has his business interests and his political interests as kind of one and the same, right? He doesn't really seem to draw those distinctions. So, what we would have had before, right, and even in Trump's first term, was not that the president could just fire, the head of the FTC or the commissioners on the FCC. So, this is vast swaths of our economy.
So this is what people who've watched this podcast know of as the unitary executive theory, these constitutional and legal theories dressing up the ability of a president, whoever the president is, to take personal control over the federal government. And it's not an entirely crazy idea, but taken to its extreme, it basically says every single person who works in the federal government works directly for the president as though they're the gardener at Mar-a-Lago. Right. And the rule of law, therefore, doesn't apply because that's passed by Congress.
Right. And the DOJ lawyers are his lawyers, right, which has never been held.
So your point here, and you wrote about this early on, is that the corruption matters more because the power is greater to implement the corruption. Also, the potential threat of I will have the antitrust division not approve your merger unless you give to my library or buy crypto for my company or something like that. That is not something that we've seen before. Are these broad constitutional theories being used in the area of presidential emergency powers, in the war powers, or has it not really been necessary for them to do that?
I think there is an extraordinary theory that dovetails with some of this, what you and Dan just discussed, which is basically in the space of national security, if the president says it, then the courts can't check it. So if the president declares there's an invasion, the courts can't second-guess that decision. If the president says that there's an armed conflict with supposed narco-terrorists, the judges can't look behind that statement.
Or they won't.
So that's what the Trump administration is arguing in some of these litigations, where in the context of the Alien Enemies Act, they said in the proclamation there's an invasion, therefore we get to invoke this law. And the government is saying, well, the judges don't have the expertise, don't have the democratic mandate of the president in making that kind of decision. And so when you combine this absence of internal checks within the executive branch, you look at the Department of Justice's lawyers as the president's lawyers, as though the DOJ, Office of Legal Counsel, were in fact White House counsel. And so they're not sitting there independently reviewing the facts and the law to say that actually is illegal, you can't do that. Right? And then you're going and saying, well, Article 3, the courts also can't check us. Right? That is a pathway to unlimited power, unlimited abuse of these authorities, unless you can get Article 1, the Congress, to stand up and vote and say, we can override a presidential veto, so a supermajority of the Congress to say, we actually disagree with your legal theory.
But one of the things that we've heard, for example, when I spoke to Yuval Levin, who's a conservative political theorist at the American Enterprise Institute, emphatically making the point that behind the presidential power grab, behind the role of the Supreme Court, is Congress not doing its job, not being
Absolutely.
Congress. And that's true so far in both of these areas that we've been discussing. And, so the year starts out with this shock and awe and this blizzard of executive actions. And we made the point even then, a lot of times I used to write these executive orders. They're basically, most of the time, glorified press releases. In some instances, malevolent glorified press releases. But some of them have real teeth. And those are the ones that are most worrisome. And we've seen, as the year has gone on, both this incredibly aggressive push by the White House, a heartening response by the courts, and a mobilization by civic groups and others in fighting back, even as many parts of civil society who have great resources and should have stood up, law firms, universities, kind of crumbled in a moment like this. But then as the year goes on, this winds up being a great constitutional clash. And we're having this conversation in December. That's how you can tell we're about to have our office holiday party in a few minutes. But we actually don't know how 2025 fully is going to be remembered, because we don't know what is going to happen at the Supreme Court, where so many of these things end up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court this Supreme Court, with its very conservative supermajority, has been greatly enamored of presidential power. They were for giving presidents the ability to fire independent agency heads. Back when Donald Trump was a liberal Democrat, these justices were for that. But there's some really big tests. And one of them that we don't know is the cases involving the tariffs, where we at the Brennan Center filed, I think, 5 briefs in support of the idea that presidents cannot just unilaterally declare worldwide tariffs, which Trump did with the Liberation
Which is an
Day.
enormous corruption issue, to give that much unilateral power in addition to all the other issues, to have the president just be able to slap tariffs on people.
Well, in part because the president can issue, or rather the Treasury Department can issue licenses that exempt certain actors from those tariffs. And so,
and there was a pattern, this research has shown there's a pattern in the first Trump administration where Republican aligned firms got more tariff exceptions than Democratic aligned firms. So,
it's one of the reasons we as a country moved from tariffs to the income tax during the progressive era. That was considered a form of political reform because it was such a jamboree of corruption back then. But back then it was Congress that would pass the tariff bill every year, and do wool gloves get a different rate than leather gloves and that sort of thing. Back then presidents did not dream of claiming an emergency and claiming the ability to do it on their own. So now this case has been argued. Michael McConnell, the conservative Stanford law professor who was a federal judge, he says he thinks this is the most important case on presidential power since the Truman seizure of the steel mills. He thought it was so important he joined the team challenging it. What do we think is going to happen in this case? How would it play out? And how do we think this court is likely to rule in general on again, what I at least think is this extraordinary power grab attempt that will unbalance our government if it succeeds?
I mean, each one of these litigations on emergency powers is a little bit different. They're implicating different constitutional and statutory authorities. And so the tariffs that Trump has imposed, the worldwide tariffs, there are other tariffs imposed under other laws, are all under a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
We don't
Great
do acronyms
name.
here.
Okay.
IEEPA,
This law,
though.
IEEPA
is
it's a
memorable. Just
handful.
remember
Yeah.
IEEPA.
IEEPA.
Yeah.
But
Their second album was better than their first.
Yeah.
under IEEPA, you can impose economic sanctions, and so basically shut bad actors out of international markets. There is not a good argument that the text of IEEPA allows you to impose tariffs. And so under a strained reading of that text of the law, the administration is saying, okay, we can do these worldwide tariffs on every country. And this creates an avenue for the courts, without getting into, is there actually this sort of immense threat that justifies using this emergency power, to just say the text of this law doesn't allow you to impose tariffs. Or if there's some sort of ambiguity in the text, there would be such vast economic consequences. There would be such major questions of policy implicated by that ambiguous, overbroad text that we just can't read it that way. Or there are some fundamental problems with this statute. And so I think there are some off-ramps for the Supreme Court in the tariffs case, in part because there's a whole universe of trade laws and tariff laws, like the Tariff Act.
Well, they
of
can do
1930.
tariffs other ways than this. They just in all of these things, they chose to do it illegally to show they could, when they had ways to do these things legally. And one of the things that's really quite striking is that for a presidency that wants to be seen as having a particularly ambitious agenda, they've proposed almost no legislation of any significance at all. And Congress has been reduced even more than it has in other years to a kind of either a cheering or booing section for the president. And that again goes to the kind of the failure of Congress to actually act as Congress. The corruption issue is interesting because it's not really before the courts right now. We've got this.
Well, the courts have done a lot of damage, but yeah.
Well, this is where the Supreme Court, the world we're in, the politics we're inhabiting, is it brought to us more than anyone else by John Roberts and his colleagues on the Supreme Court, who he said, "Oh, I'm just calling balls." When he was nominated, he said, "Oh, I believe the duty of a justice is to just call balls and strikes." It was brilliant spin and utterly unrelated to what he actually did as leader of this court on the law of democracy. Citizens United in 2010, Shelby County in 2013, and all the other campaign finance rulings since. Is there anything left of the campaign finance laws?
I mean, technically, sure, there's something left of the campaign finance laws. There's still laws on the books. There's still this agency in Washington, the Federal Election Commission.
Coordination rules exist.
Coordination, well, yeah, we won't even get into what those are. But there's not much left of the campaign finance rules. I think what's fascinating that's going on here, right, is that you said this. John Roberts has been interested in this agenda for decades, right? So you've got a sort of perfect storm of a long-term ideological project to empower the presidency, strip away campaign finance rules, anti-corruption safeguards, which is not exactly Trumpist, but it's converging now with a completely unmoored presidency in a way that is very alarming. And whether the Supreme Court knows and just doesn't care about the practical implications of their decisions or likes them is very hard to tell. I think that John Roberts in particular, but also some of the other justices, have adopted a very kind of cynical view of politics, right, and power, right? And so corruption plays into that, not just in the campaign finance cases, but in some of the those other anti-corruption cases, which is just the overriding concern is, politics is a dirty business. When the government starts to come in and clean it up, that's just bad. So you're just going to sweep away all those laws.
When they heard the Shelby County case,
Right.
Justice Scalia, when it was pointed out that the Voting Rights Act had passed the Senate 98-0, he said, well, there you go. It just proves they're
It's a very, to
shallow.
quote John Roberts, heads I win, tails you lose. I mean, it's however they interpret everything sort of based on the outcome they want.
But this is becoming strikingly, as the year ends, clearly a growing political issue.
Mm-hmm.
There was a poll over the summer that showed that corruption was the number one issue. And my reaction was, how do people know that? In other words, the news media has been so fractured and so degraded. It's not as though the typical way that people learn about stuff, certifying something as a scandal, still exists. Yet, nevertheless, what people are seeing, they get the idea that the system is rigged in some way. And I think this is going to play out more in the politics of the coming years than in the courts. I think on the presidential power issue, on the power grab, first and foremost, we're going to find out a lot from the coming months of court rulings. A question, too, is whether or not this becomes a political issue. As the year ends and the dust is settling, how would you quickly characterize what we've learned about these issues?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we've learned is that when some of the immigration policies are this radical, again, sending someone to a notorious prison in El Salvador without due process, political tides turn. People understand that families get torn apart, that people get sent to places where they absolutely shouldn't be. And the public, that policy polled really poorly for the executive branch, even though it came in on an immigration agenda, was very popular to start on immigration. And again, the Alien Enemies Act invocation and deportations degraded that support. On war powers, people have polled, is it popular to invade Venezuela and try to do a regime change war? No, it's not. And so you see some fledgling efforts in the Congress to start pushing back on that. And actually this week, there will be some votes on something called a war powers resolution in the Congress to sort of forestall an escalation into a war with Venezuela.
And in other words, you're starting to see some Republicans, as well as Democrats, step up on this, and people who believed the idea we weren't going to have forever wars and are wondering why are we picking a country largely at random and trying to make regime change happen. How do you, as you think about a year from now, what are we going to think about the politics of the corruption and how it will play out?
Well, the politics is very intertwined in what Katherine was just talking about. So one of the other things Trump did in recent weeks, he pardoned, we're talking about Venezuela, he pardoned the former president of Honduras, who has run, I think, something like $400 million, was convicted of running something like $400 million worth of drugs into the United States, even as we're blowing up, whoever is poor fishermen in the Caribbean. So the spectacle of this kind of blatant corruption, and it was Roger Stone who lobbied for that pardon.
Is that right?
Yes, it was
the guy with the Nixon tattoo on his back.
Yeah, the Nixon tattoo, the political fixer. And Hernandez had been a big supporter of a crypto island off the coast of Honduras. It's a
perfect
decadent story. So you
unified field theory of crass.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have this epic corruption going on while you're also having these really major abuses of presidential power. And I think for many people in the public, it's all of a piece, right? It is pushing so many limits that it is making people alarmed. I think, though, one of the problems, maybe this is a good place to end, is whoever wants to offer a different vision of government is actually going to have to put their money where their mouth is. And they're going to have to actually offer solutions. Reform of the War Powers Act, real anti-corruption safeguards. One of the problems—
The Insurrection Act and the Alien Enemies Act.
The Democrats and Biden the last time after Trump's first term, they also made lots of noises about how this was the most epic, scandalous administration in history. And then you didn't see much afterwards. Right. And I think the public is going to expect more.
This is a theme over and over again. There needs to be an aggressive, affirmative, creative reform agenda to rebuild, to do these things, not to just tut-tut about it. People won't believe the critique if they don't think there's something better and something different and that they mean it. Members of Congress who want to give speeches on corruption need to address things like stock trading by members of Congress, just to give one example. One of the great tasks for all of us is to be really creative in imagining what the next government should look like.
Right.
I don't mean on partisan terms. I mean if the Justice Department has been wrecked, if the pardon power has been grossly abused, and on and on and on, what do we want to have in its place? It's in a way, it's a kind of an exciting prospect, although one would hope not to have to clean up the wreckage of the Constitution. But it is part of what we have to do. Thank you both for all you do and for being part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Katherine. So much of what's unfolded this year has been around the issues of voting and elections, which we at the Brennan Center care about a great deal. These things are being tested too. And to discuss what's happened and what's going to happen next, we have some of the country's leading experts, legal activists, and scholars on this issue. Wendy Weiser is the Vice President for Democracy at the Brennan Center, and Sean Morales-Doyle runs our Voting Rights and Elections program. It's no surprise that we care a great deal about elections and making sure that we have free and fair elections. And this was a dramatic year in that respect as well. Also going back, rewinding one more time to the very beginning of the year, to that frigid January day when President Trump was inaugurated for the second time and really began right away trying to undermine our elections in new ways. At least that's what we see. Sean, what happened on that first day, and how does that play into the broader narrative of the year?
Well, I think what happened on that first day, people remember one of the big things that happened on that first day was that Trump pardoned all of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. And people probably have a lot of feelings about those pardons, but don't necessarily connect them to what it means for our elections moving forward. And what it means is that from day one, this is an administration that's sending a message to people who would subvert elections, that would help the president try to overturn the results of an election. We've got your back. And that's the very first salvo in what has become a very clear concerted effort by this administration to undermine our elections. And it's important because, Trump tried to overturn an election before, but he did so in a sort of desperate last-ditch effort to hold on to power.
It was shambolic. It was
exactly. And there were people ready to say no to him and not ready to go along with it. But this time around, he began from the very first day in office setting up a multi-pronged strategy to undermine our elections, and it starts with those pardons on January 6th.
A fact, and I don't know if this is true, somebody was recently finally arrested for laying pipe bombs at the Republican and Democratic Party headquarters. And my understanding is that the attorney for that person may argue that he's been pardoned because he, in fact, himself was allegedly an election denier and was merely part of the throng seeking to get justice done on January 6th. What are some of the kinds of things that people don't know about, for example, in terms of demanding data from states?
Yeah, so we look at this campaign beginning with those pardons, but really we see it falling into kind of four major categories of activity from this administration. There's the sending the message to would-be subverters that we've got your back. There's the flip side of that coin, which is threatening the people who run our elections with criminal, politicized prosecutions, et cetera. And then there is the repeal of federal protections of voting rights. And finally, the president trying to sort of write the rules to elections. And actually, this effort by the Department of Justice to go and collect voter files from across the country, from every state in the country, and construct a massive national voter file kind of fits into each of those last three categories in different ways. It's basically threatening states and suing states to get this data and compiling it per the president's order, his own executive order, trying to change the way elections are run, trying to take over our state elections and run voter lists at the federal level. And that's important because under our Constitution, the president actually has no role in running our elections.
Very explicitly,
not at all.
No role.
Yeah.
And this move to get all this data, and we were actually talking about this yesterday, it's both the Justice Department, DHS, it's also the political party and the outside voter groups, the groups like True the Vote, gathering up all this data. And it is a bit of a mystery of what it is exactly that they intend to do with it, because they clearly want to use it for something to undermine the trust in the election. Somebody was making the point that in a sense, the big issue where there's a lot of disinformation in 2020 was about mail-in voting. And the risk that we were all worried about in 2024 was that they wouldn't certify elections. Here it's the gathering of data. Why do you think this data is being gathered?
Well, there's a lot of mischief that can be used with this data. So first, it's important for people to know that there's a lot of personal information on the voter files that is not supposed to be in the hands of the federal government and that is protected by state privacy laws, by federal privacy laws. Your voter history, your voter registration history, your social security numbers might be there, or your driver's license number. So there's a lot of private information. But what you can do if you gather up that information, you might be able to create false narratives to find that there has been some mischief or that there have been people who've been improperly registered
and
voting.
Turns out Russia was casting all the votes. We now can prove, and the elections therefore are illegitimate.
You might be able to try to force or cause something to happen that the federal government isn't allowed to do directly. They've been trying to push for aggressive purges of the voter rolls, deleting voters off of the voter rolls. And
what's wrong with making sure that the rolls are accurate and that only eligible people are on the rolls?
Oh, absolutely. This is something that is something states should do, and they do. And it is a responsibility of state election officials, and they do that, and it's very important that they do that. The fear, and what we've seen a lot of outside agitators and election deniers pushing, and now increasingly the administration is pushing very aggressive voter rolls that threaten to eliminate a lot of eligible voters, very irresponsible voter rolls under some of these conspiracy theories in a way to try to undermine participation or even manipulate elections. And if that happens, and taking it out of the hands of the responsible managers of the elections to try to push for sort of more irresponsible actions that could eliminate eligible voters from the voter rolls, that could be very dangerous to the election. And if you have the voter rolls and you claim that you found all these ineligible people, you can push to eliminate those people from the voter rolls. That can actually interfere with their ability to participate.
That's an actual tangible thing that misinformation can be used for. One of the things that's interesting, I think it's important, we follow obviously all this stuff very closely. There's such a blizzard of activity on this and on everything else. In March, there was an executive order, one of the executive orders, probably multiple that day, on elections where the president purported to personally take control of our election system. And Sean, as you said, the Constitution is quite clear. Presidents have no role in running elections. It states with Congress able to pass laws. And this is one of the stories of the year that we heard about when it came to presidential power and war powers and other things, that there was an aggressive push, but there actually were some places where it's quite clear it's possible to stop abuses. What, in particular in the executive order, remind us what happened and where things stand.
Yeah. So the president, through an executive order in March, purported to make a lot of changes to election rules, including trying to require that all Americans show a passport or a similar document when they register to vote.
And half of all Americans don't have a passport.
That is right. Half of Americans do not have a passport. And it purported to try to decertify all the voting machines in the country. It purported to allow DOGE and also DHS to access all the voter files, like we're seeing DOJ trying to gather up. It purported to threaten election officials with unrelated law enforcement action if they don't participate in efforts to try to look for phantom voter fraud. It is trying to pressure states to change their mail voting rules. So in a whole range of ways, it tried to assert control over elections. And as Sean has said, and as you had said, this is not the president's role. He has no authority to do that. And in one bright spot, there's been some real progress in preventing this from going forward. The Brennan Center with other allies actually brought a lawsuit challenging the portion of this executive order that tried to require a passport to vote. There have been some others, lawsuits by states challenging some of the other portions. And we now have an order from a court permanently blocking
on
that
October
from
30th.
from going into effect.
So
It was on Halloween, actually.
Oh, it was on Halloween.
I'm pretty sure.
Yes,
Were
it
you
was.
carrying around, like, were you in a costume when you learned
Well,
about
we
it?
sued him on April 1st, April Fool's Day, and we won on Halloween. So it's been an interesting
Wow,
schedule.
that's exciting.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what day the final
appeal
ruling-
gets decided. Yeah, I don't know.
But so this was this is part of the pattern we saw in a whole bunch of areas where the lower courts, the lower federal courts, are one of the real bright spots.
Absolutely.
Standing up, and it's judges appointed by Republicans and judges appointed by Democrats. And of course, the worry has been, and the concern has been, as those cases move up to the Supreme Court, which is much more ideological, in a lot of ways much more partisan, we don't know how that's going to play out. And the voting cases have not really gotten to the Supreme Court, although they have made some rulings.
Yes, I think the story of how the Supreme Court's going to interact with voting is maybe more of a 2026 story than a 2025 story, but we've gotten some preview in the oral arguments the Supreme Court just held on a case coming out of Louisiana that does not bode well. I mean, this is we don't know what's going to happen, and we hope they do the right thing, but this is a court that has spent years now doing damage to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, doing damage to all kinds of protections that federal law has provided for voters. And so we're very worried about what they might do in a number of cases that they have before them.
And this is, destroying the Voting Rights Act was John Roberts' personal crusade since he was a baby lawyer right out of law school at the Justice Department, and I think his first job. As everybody probably has followed, Texas redistricting happens. It's supposed to happen around the time of the census. Mm-hmm. Gerrymandering has been with us since the beginning of the country. Both parties do it when they can. This time, Texas, in the middle of the decade, did a very aggressive partisan gerrymander aiming to squeeze out 5 seats at the expense of communities of color for the Republicans, all at the behest of somebody who doesn't live in Texas, President Trump. And it led to a rather remarkable partisan arms race all over the country that looked like, in partisan terms, it'll turn out to be something of a wash because of the response by Democratic states and Republicans, all gerrymandering. But this Supreme Court case on the Voting Rights Act could cannonball into this pond and really upend a lot of things.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court actually intervened in the Texas case in a way that was really concerning. So it wasn't just a partisan gerrymander in Texas. The lower court issued in a very lengthy 160-page ruling findings that it was actually a racial gerrymander too, that they were actually accomplishing these partisan aims by targeting specifically representatives of color and communities of color and their representation in a way
which
that was
the Justice Department had urged them to do.
At the explicit request of the Justice Department to go after those communities and those representatives. And that, the Constitution, at least as of a few weeks ago, we thought prohibited that kind of explicit racial targeting and racial gerrymandering. And in a emergency order, a shadow docket ruling, the Supreme Court on a stay application blocked that lower court ruling, saying you can't go forward with this redistricting plan because it was racially discriminatory, and actually said, it said very little since they were not opinions for the court, but it said they were likely to win on the merits, and that this was the fact that it was principally a partisan aim seemed to excuse all of those racially discriminatory tactics along the way, and that is something that's really concerning, especially with the other Voting Rights Act cases that are coming up behind that we're waiting for decisions in.
Because in a 2019 case, the Supreme Court had said it would not police partisan gerrymandering, wouldn't even let federal courts hear those cases.
Unless Congress told it how to.
Unless Congress told it how to. And this goes to Congress and its role and the politics of it. So there was a success in blocking so far the egregious executive order. The executive order itself was basically an attempt to try to enact a piece of a much bigger piece of legislation that we've said would be an egregious bit of voter suppression, the SAVE Act. Mm-hmm. What is the SAVE Act, and where does it stand now? Wendy, do you want to?
Sure. Actually, the SAVE Act was a significant piece of legislation to try to have a show me your papers law, to try to require people to show a passport or a birth certificate to register to vote across the country, to require them to show up in person to do that. This is not only would block millions of people from voting, from being able to register to vote, but it also could even prevent people from engaging in mail registration or online registration, because it actually required them to show up in person
every single
to do
time.
This. Every single time they register and re-register.
You move across town, you have to re-register. You can't just do it.
You got to show up in person and show your passport every
And it was deeply unpopular. And one reason why it was deeply unpopular is because actually a large segment of the population, more than 50% of the population, is female. And of the married women in particular, most of us do not have our current legal names on our birth certificates, on our citizenship documents, for those of us that do have that. More than 79% of us do not have current legal names on those documents. And so the impact of that is even far more sweeping than the already 21 million people that don't even have these documents at all.
And Sean, you've done research that showed that even if people say, I have these documents, 21 million people don't have ready access to them. Right. In other words, half of all Americans don't have a passport. People have a birth certificate, but honestly,
but do they?
They have
do
no
they know
idea.
Where it is?
Where is your birth certificate?
I actually, because I've been doing this work, I do know where my birth certificate is. Most people.
It's in a shoebox in my mother's closet,
it's in a safe deposit box back home. Yeah.
No, people really don't know, and most of the time they don't really need to know. And so this was the SAVE Act, and it passed the House of Representatives.
As it did last Congress. But it was blocked in the United States Senate. It actually has not come to a vote because they don't have the votes to overcome the filibuster to get cloture. And now we at the Brennan Center do not believe the filibuster is a good thing. Agreed.
We don't think there should be a filibuster, but as long as it exists, I think it's entirely appropriate to use to block a voter suppression law of this kind. And so that's another bit of encouraging facts from this year. It's important when people look at this really egregious thing. And again, I don't think it can be overstated enough that for an administration, for the federal government to work to undermine elections, that's not only not normal, it's never happened before in American history.
Yeah.
When the federal government has gotten involved, it hasn't been that often, but it's almost always been to try to stop states from abusing the rights of their own people.
Right, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Voting Rights Act,
and
Reconstruction, how do you see this all playing out in the next year? Of course, a lot of this stuff was leading up to this very critical 2026 election. And it's clear people are pretty riled up and want to make their voices heard. What do you think is going to happen over the next year? What are we going to be talking about a year from now when we're having a look back at 2026?
So first I will say it's important, as you say, people are riled up and they want their voices to be heard. That's why the SAVE Act isn't making its way through the Senate right now. I think it wasn't just the existence of the filibuster. It's that there was a very loud groundswell of opposition from across the country, from married women who have changed their name.
It went viral.
Absolutely. People were upset about this pretty blatant attempt at vote suppression, and that's why it didn't go anywhere. And so I think heading to 2026, it's encouraging that we have that kind of groundswell of attention to these kinds of issues. I think the victories in the lower courts are encouraging against some of the worst overreaches by the executive branch. I think the fact that states run by both Democrats and Republicans have refused to hand their voter rolls over to the Department of Justice is encouraging. I think the conversation we're having next year will depend on a few things. It will depend on what happens when those court cases go up on appeal. It will depend on what the Supreme Court does in what is turning out to be 4, 5, 6 different cases that they have before them that will impact voting rights.
And to be clear, there's a real possibility, depending on how they rule and when they rule,
absolutely,
that a really crazy ruling on the Voting Rights Act could lead to another round of redistricting in coming months, although the clock is ticking on that.
Or, they've taken up this case on whether or not, as they should have, they've taken up this case on whether or not states can accept ballots that arrive, that are postmarked before Election Day but arrive after Election Day. If they make a decision in that case too late in the game and interject themselves into the rules governing mail voting, in June or something, that could really upset things and cause some chaos.
So, Wendy, I think when you started working on voting rights, you probably didn't think that saving the election would require, above all else, standing with election officials who are have long been heroes but anonymous. And these are not the glamour jobs, but they were under tremendous pressure in the last few years. What do you think is going to happen, and what do you think is really important for people to do and know about to harden the system in 2026?
Well, so I want to start with the Supreme Court. There's some real risk that voting rights law is going to suffer some major blows. One Rubicon the court has not crossed is actually blessing blatant attempts to interfere in and overturn elections. And I think we need to be very loud and really raise the cost of any court allowing that to happen.
In 2020, they didn't do it.
They didn't do it. They did many things that were that helped to upset election access along the way, to help to overturn efforts to facilitate voter participation. But blatant attempts to overturn the election, that was a place where they stopped, and that is somewhere that this time around we need to hold to that line very hard, because the risk and the concerted effort to lay the foundation to be able to do that is much more concerted right now, much more organized, much more widespread. And election officials are a key part of the solution. They have been standing firm in past elections in actually pushing back at efforts to interfere in elections. There's efforts to try to turn them, to push them, to try to put election deniers or to encourage people to interfere in elections. People need to know that is, but that has actually been the exception, not the norm. And as Sean pointed out, even with these unlawful attempts to try to get all of these voter rolls, most election officials and almost all across the country have said no. This is we're not permitted to do this, and they have rebuffed the administration's effort. The administration has sued not the Republican election officials, but it has been Republican and Democratic officials and independent officials who have pushed back against this. So election officials, we need to support them, but we do need to be vigilant. Because there are going to be threats everywhere. We need to be vigilant in both ensuring that people can participate, in flagging efforts to intimidate not only public officials, but also people that are trying to participate and communities that are mobilizing to participate, and to stand with them as the heat gets turned up against them. That is something that we're certainly planning for, but we actually need everybody's voice to support that case.
One of the worries that we have, which I don't want to overstress because it didn't happen in these recent elections, these off-year elections, is not only that the federal government could send troops in or the National Guard, but probably more realistically that ICE or CBP could magically show up in immigrant neighborhoods around election time. And this sounds like dystopian, quality cable TV science fiction. But when Governor Newsom held the announcement event to launch Proposition 50, the ballot measure they did there, the Democrats in California, on redistricting, somehow, coincidentally, a bunch of masked, armed CBP agents just showed up outside. And they said it was merely a coincidence. One of the things we've pointed out is that's illegal. Absolutely. It is illegal under a number of different laws, including a part of the Voting Rights Act that has not been struck down, Section 11. But many other laws actually prevent that from happening, and it's really important that governors and attorneys general and mayors and others like that know their rights, in effect, and know the rights of their community. We're hoping that by the end of this year coming up, we will know that there were free and fair elections, that the voters, however they vote, will have made their voices heard. But even that victory, in a sense, wouldn't be enough. This is a time when there's wreckage all around us. The Justice Department, which has been weaponized and politicized on this, but on so much else. So many other parts of the national government. What does that call on us to do? In other words, how do we build back better? Not really the right slogan. It's been tested and not worked so well for the last administration. But what is it that we ought to be thinking about, arguing for, planning for, thinking about? How do we do our democracy better than what we've been doing it?
I think the exact plan might depend a little bit on what the Supreme Court has to say in the next few months. But we have a pretty good idea about how to do democracy and do it well. I think we need to restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act and get it back to the strength that it once was, and Congress needs to do that. People around this country should be upset about this partisan arms race that you talked about. They should be upset that both parties have gone, all the way to partisan gerrymander as much as they possibly can. And the only thing that's going to stop that, we can't depend on the political parties to decide to just unilaterally lay down arms. The only thing that's going to stop that is if Congress says that's enough, you can't do this anymore.
Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to set rules on redistricting that apply to red state and blue states alike.
And they have the power to set rules that govern the way that federal elections work across the board. They have the power to restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act to stop race discrimination. They have the power to set uniform rules on mail voting and uniform rules on voter registration. And they should do that in a way that doesn't, like the SAVE Act, stop people from voting, but instead provides a ground floor for everybody so that around the country we all have the same baseline level access to our elections, and our elections actually reflect the will of the people in a way that people can feel like their government actually is responsive to them. And the further we get away from that, the easier it is for these anti-democratic forces to gain ground, because people they start losing faith in the way that this system works. But we can restore that faith, and Congress has that power. They came really close to using it a couple of years ago, and if they get back to a place where it's politically possible again, it is incumbent upon them to solve so many of these problems that we've been seeing.
And that's something that everybody can do. This is actually a place for all of us in the public to make our voices heard. Like, people are really upset about this partisan arms race and the race discrimination across the country, especially in this gerrymandering war. They are upset about the threats they're seeing to the election and the interference and all that meddling that's going on. And the only way to actually stop this from constantly recurring is to get uniform national rules, to get Congress to pass something to fix this and to correct this system. And we need to demand that. They're not going to do it if we don't demand that they do it. And we need to demand that they do it.
But also, people should see, people are upset about all those things. People are upset about, how much it costs to go to the grocery store, and they're upset about a lot of things that have nothing to do with voting and democracy. But what they see is that no matter who they put in office, the people who they're electing to office aren't responding to the things that they're upset about. The only way that people are going to be happy is if they have a government that is responsive. And a government that is responsive comes from a democracy that is designed to be responsive. And that's what people should be fighting for if they want to make progress on all of the issues that they care about.
Where people can vote, where the districts in which they vote are actually set up to have competitive elections.
Absolutely.
Where massive amounts of money from billionaires don't dominate the political system, and much more. There's a lot to do. And in fact, this is something people in both parties care about a great deal.
Our research shows that when you have fair redistricting systems in place that aren't all about party, you not only get more competitive elections, but you get higher turnout in those elections. And that's not a coincidence. People go to vote when they think that their vote matters, and they need to feel that their vote matters.
And Wendy, as you think about a year from today, when we're preparing for next year's holiday party, what do you want to see having happened in 2026?
Well, I do think that this threat is, as you mentioned, unlike any that we've ever seen before. So the first thing I would like to be able to report, like we've been reporting now, that so far we've been managed to hold back all the worst of it. That the administration has not succeeded in shaking the foundations of our electoral system, and that it stood strong. And it stood strong because we mobilized and we were able to help support election officials and the law enforcement and the communities that are mobilizing.
People of conscience from all parties.
From people of conscience from all parties who are mobilizing, and that we did so in a way that actually strengthens people's resolve to fix this system so that this doesn't happen again. This cannot be what our politics is. We need to move back to a system that works for everybody, where corruption is not the first thing that people are always thinking about, where the system is actually delivering for Americans. And so that is the momentum, I hope, from that successful effort to maintain and protect our elections can help drive for a real reform moment.
It's a big fight, but it's the best fight worth having. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's 2025, at least a bit of 2025. If it feels like it's been an exhausting year, it has. But there's a lot that's been clarified, too. We've seen a really tremendous testing of our constitutional system, a push for presidential power. And again, all presidents want to expand their power. But we believe, and I certainly believe, that what this president is trying to do goes well beyond what other presidents have done or tried to do, especially in peacetime. And that is one of the reasons that the laws of war are being used domestically, because they give presidents so much power. We've never seen, at the same time, as we've just heard, an administration working to undermine elections all over the country, to undermine public trust, but also to undermine the actual institutions. So there's no question that we're seeing a grab for power that we have not seen in this country, that a lot of us think is what we don't want to have as Americans. But as we've heard in a whole bunch of different ways, that's not the entire story. We know that a lot of the institutions that we hoped would stand up to abuse of power crumbled, law firms, universities. But we found out also that there were other parts of our country in 2025, people from both parties who stood up for the rule of law, whether it was courts, lower courts, trial courts, judges appointed by Democrats and by Republicans who stood up, state governments and city and county governments that stood up, and people all over the country who made clear with their voices and even their votes that they actually care about the rule of law, they care about the Constitution, these kind of abstract things that we don't think of as, quote, kitchen table issues turn out to be something people care about a lot. And so it feels in a lot of ways like at the end of the year, I wouldn't say we've reached a tipping point, but there's a moment of clarity that we haven't had all throughout. What we've seen first is that this push for power, while really strong, is not inexorable. It is not inevitable. It is not unstoppable if people are willing to stop it. It's also the case that people care about this. Now, one of the things that happened throughout this year is a lot of the professional politicians, especially in the Democratic Party, a lot of them said, oh, this issue of democracy, well, it turns out maybe people don't care about it so much. What they care about, of course, as they should, is rising prices and other things. But democracy and the Constitution, those are kind of noble sentiments, but not really something that is going to become part of our major push for thinking about our agenda. And by the end of the year, I think people have begun to see that if you want to solve the problems in the country, you have to fix the democracy. If you want to have the government work for people, then it needs to actually be fair, be free, not distorted by political pressure or corruption. And it turns out that a new politics is forming in front of our eyes, something that I think is appealing to people across the political spectrum who don't want corruption, who want to have a fair election, who want government to actually work. One of the things that I think a lot of people note, and sometimes a little bit under their breath, was when they look at the kind of extremism of DOGE, which you may remember was for a few months wrecking agencies and wreaking havoc across the federal government. The premise of DOGE was that government really needed to work better. That wasn't what they were doing. But there was a kernel of an idea there. It's really not enough, even as we constitute a new politics around these issues, to say, oh, we're going to just restore things the way they were. The way they were not serving people. The way they were helped create this idea that government was out of touch, which leads to this kind of endless surge of populist resentment that we see in this country and lots of other countries. It's really critically important, it turns out, not just to stop bad things, not just to defend the system, but to have a vision for what a better way to run the government, what a better democracy looks like. There's a charisma of ideas that's necessary to give people hope to stand up to abuses. It's not enough to say no. What matters more is what we all say yes to. I think that's a lot clearer at the end of 2025 than it was at the beginning of 2025. What are those new ideas? I think they're in process of being crafted and developed. We need to make sure that we deal with presidential power. We need to make sure that we deal with the campaign finance system, which has been demolished, and that we deal with the corruption we're seeing right now of a kind we really haven't ever seen in this country. We need to make sure that if the Supreme Court follows through on its vibes and threats and wrecks what's left of the Voting Rights Act, that we have a real system of protecting voting all across the country, and so much more. I think these issues will become part of what defines the next political era. We know throughout American history that when there's scandal, when there's abuse, that's when you get reform. Not always, but that's when it happens. It's up to all of us, yes, to defend our Constitution, to defend the democracy we love, but it's up to all of us also to be part of writing that next chapter, of making sure that a season of degradation and even despair at times is followed by a season of reform and renewal. That's what I hope happens in 2026 and the years after that. Have a wonderful holiday, and we will be fighting for the things we care about here at the Brennan Center in the year to come. Thank you.